Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week from outside of New York, Carla Robbins, who is with the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Carla, great to see you.
Hey, Ivo. Hey, Elise. Hey, Bobby.
Hello.
And you're beating me to it. Also
Sorry.
joining us. No, that's quite all right. Also joining us from Washington, D.C., Elise Labott, who is now a foreign policy columnist and formerly with CNN. Elise, great to have you.
Great to be here.
And all the way from London, Bobby Ghosh, who is the opinion editor of Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, wonderful to see you as well.
Nice to be on.
Lots of things to talk about this week. So let's start with the AUKUS Ruckus. The fallout of the agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to have a new strategic security partnership that for some reason fell badly in Paris, but perhaps also in other parts of the world. Bobby, you've been in London watching how the Europeans in general and the French in particular have been reacting to it, and how the administration is starting to clean up the problem, the mess, I think is probably the right word, that was created by the announcement, if not by the actual series of actions. How did Europe respond, and what can we expect?
Well, I think the responses have so far run along fairly predictable lines. In Britain, where I am now, there's always a little bit of pleasure taken at French discomfort, and so there's a lot of joke making from the Prime Minister on down about the French getting their knickers in a twist. In France, of course, there is, as you say, quite there's a ruckus, and it's been quite raucous, and quite a lot of it is directed at the United States, not at Australia. Very interestingly, there's been some criticism of Australia, but most of it, I would say, has been directed at the Biden administration. There's been some fairly undiplomatic language used, including, being stabbed in the back and so on and so forth. The rest of Europe has been quite muted. So the French are beginning to feel, I think, that they're standing alone. They've been trying to make this about Europe, that Europe has been somehow dissed by the Biden administration, and that this is something that the EU should be getting all hot and bothered about, and that NATO is in play again, and that this should basically this should revive the old red herring about an independent European military policy. The rest of Europe is not really going along with that. The Germans, let's face it, matter more than everybody else, have been quite muted. Now, the Germans are somewhat distracted by the fact that this weekend they're going to have to elect finally the successor to Angela Merkel, but I think that's not the main reason. The Germans are trying not to make this about Europe, and quite satisfied with it being about France. So there's a lot of noise in Paris, silence in much of the rest of Europe, and some chuckling taking place here in London. Washington, judging from this distance, I think that there is some talk of fixing this and mollifying the French, but it hasn't gotten beyond talk, not yet. And I don't know that it'll ever get beyond that. I can't imagine that, I can't foresee what the Biden administration can do in substantive terms that would satisfy the French sense of being offended in some way by this whole thing. I'm actually trying to look at other parts of the world as to who can benefit from this. France now, I think, has some discount prices available on submarines, and I can imagine a few countries around the world that would be interested. It's striking that the French are making very nice with the Indians, for instance, and the Indians are very flattered to have that sort of attention. And it wouldn't surprise me if an India or a Brazil or a country like that were to take advantage of the ruckus and make a clever deal for itself.
Interesting point. I think that leverage comes in many different ways, even when you seem to be on the losing end. Elise, in Washington, other than the transatlantic talking heads, of which I guess I'm one, who have been worried about this, seems to be that everybody thinks this was a great move, and if the French don't like it, well, that's just the way it happens. Why should we care? Is that the right way to think about it, and do you think that's the way the Biden administration thinks about it?
I think a couple of things. First of all, I think that the U.S. woefully underestimated the way that France was going to react. And yes, I mean, there is a commercial aspect to this. This was a $66 billion deal for France. The French were calling it the contract of the century. Macron is up for election next year. And, this all plays to, the French economy and France, as Bobby was saying, wanting to be this leader in a independent Europe. But anybody that kind of blows it off as some, commercial spat, I think misses the point. And so, some transatlantic analysts, in the sense that, first of all, the idea that the U.S. just didn't care how France was going to feel, and made them collateral damage of this deal, I think says something, A, about how it handles its allies, B, about, its strategic kind of maneuvering and this oscillating and feeling like, this is a more important strategic pact right now. You see the U.S. with the Quad, with India, Japan, Australia, reorienting towards this kind of free Indo-Pacific, which is code for China. And the idea that it could just, abandon an ally in that sense, just for, even if it's a short period of time on one specific deal, does kind of, I think, cause other allies to say, hey, okay, what about when I'm on the chopping block? And we've seen some other instances of that with the Nord Stream, and how the U.S. got out of Afghanistan, just kind of looking at its own narrow interest for that time. I think that is really part of the problem, and also the perception that gives to its allies. When the United States says that, France, which has really tried to make an effort over the last several years to deepen its involvement in the Indo-Pacific, is just completely cut out of it in favor of Australia and England. And Bobby said it's been quiet in like the English are taking, a little bit of kind of pleasure at this. The French are also kind of not even they recalled their ambassador to Australia and US. Interestingly, they didn't recall it from London to say as if London's like a bit partner in it. So the whole perception of who's, cuddling up with who, I think is also what France is upset about, that this kind of upends their strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And I think, the way that the US handled it was really graceless.
Carla, I think the question is was this a behavioral problem that we didn't behave in the right way? Or is there a deeper issue here that this is really the manifestation of what we've been talking about for the last 10 years, the pivot to Asia, which, after all, was a term coined by Kurt Campbell when he was Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs under Hillary Clinton, and now, of course, is the Asia czar in the White House. And pivot, last I looked, is you can't pivot to something without pivoting away from something. And the Europeans have long worried about the fact that paying more attention to Asia and the Pacific means the US paying less attention to Europe. Is that what's going on? Or is it just, we forgot our manners for a while?
I mean, they could have gotten a lot of benefit from what actually is sort of a deal of strategic vision, and particularly coming after Afghanistan, where everybody said that they were just blundering around in the dark, faithless allies, abandoning the world. And here they were working on this. Obviously, they didn't come up with this overnight. They were working on this, what could have been a big rollout. Look, we're not a faithless ally. Look, we are going to be major players in the world. Biden said he was getting out of Afghanistan because he really wanted to focus on Asia. I mean, they could have trumpeted this and they stumbled over their own feet. They had to think about how they were going to manage this. And Ivo, of course, Kurt Campbell came up with that term and everybody went nuts at the time, as you well recall. And they were saying, well, maybe it's rebalancing. Maybe we have a better word we can come up with, because pivot, if you pivot towards something, you pivot away from something. It's not like they didn't know how nuts people went the first time they tried this. So this raises this question, did they do this on purpose to diss the French? I doubt that. Are they dumb? Do they forget history? I mean, this raises this question that, once again, the question we had about Afghanistan, which is, if something is this important, why don't you do your homework first and try to figure out, they lost a good deal of the benefit of, just the political benefit is domestically and internationally of what is actually quite a big deal and quite a good deal by tripping over their own, rollout, by pissing off the French so much. And how much of this is a failure of process, that the administration is understaffed at state and defense on the Europe side? How much of it is they're just not good at foreign policy? Not good on a strategic level. I mean, this is good strategy, but damn, I'm really nervous about this. They blew the Afghanistan thing and now they've blown this. Honestly and truly, Ivo, I'm really nervous.
And just super quick to add to Carla's point, which I 100% agree with, wasn't this supposed to be the administration that was going to demonstrate competence after this buffoonery that we saw in the Trump administration? Everyone was like, the adults are back in the room. You had Kurt Campbell, you had Jake Sullivan, you have Tony Blinken. These are people that you think of are the bastion of, foreign policy process and competency. There were so many better ways that this could be handled. And also, look, this deal with the French and the Australians was being done with Lockheed Martin, a huge US contracting firm. There could have been a way to, as Carla suggests, to kind of soften this and make this a win-win for everybody by going to the French and saying, hey, we really think the French need nuclear instead of the diesel submarines that you were giving them. We want a little bit more protection in the Indo-Pacific. Let's do this together. Instead, they just kind of cut them out, negotiated in secret, and as Carla said, just blew it.
Yeah, and actually, it's worth pointing out the French are especially disappointed because they had such high hopes for this administration, and specifically with Tony Blinken. I mean, if I've heard it once from a French diplomat, I've heard it 100 times. He speaks French. Which they took this to be a huge deal that they had a francophone of
well, Kerry was a francophone too.
That's right, and they had another francophile at the State Department, and so that allusion to the knife in the back, I think, tells you the depth of their disappointment.
Yeah, I thought Le Drian, who I think the foreign minister of France, who probably had the most choice words, which you could write a dictionary of how not to speak as a diplomat, probably had the biggest knife out there when he said this administration is like its predecessor without the tweets, which I think was a pretty hard point. And of course, Tony Blinken not only speaks French, he lived and grew up in Paris, right, and went to school there. I do want to get to but there is this larger strategic issue, and ultimately, I think, over time, yes, this has hurt the relationship with France, and clearly France has not been able to get all the Europeans together. But there is this bigger question that I think lies at the core of the administration's policy. On the one hand, they very much want to focus on China. That's where the competition is, and everything is driven by this focus on Asia. And yet, on the other hand, and we'll get to that in a minute as well, but anytime Biden makes a speech about foreign policy, he makes a speech about democracies versus autocracies, and that the fact that democracies need to prove that they can work together. Well, what's the greatest conglomeration of democracies in the world? It ain't in Asia. It's in Europe. And so how does you balance that issue? And I wonder, Bobby, if people in Europe are just not taking that seriously, and they're saying, no, that's nice words, but it's really about China. and we may have to choose between China and the United States, or are they taking it seriously, and do they think that's maybe still the basis for some future cooperation?
I don't think anybody is taking it seriously. You know, I don't think the White House is taking it especially seriously. The guest list at the Summit of Democracies is going to be filled with people whose commitment to democracy is highly suspect. You know, the administration has just abandoned Afghan democracy, has just rewarded the Sisi government in Egypt. There's any number of examples of which the Biden administration's rhetoric and actions don't sort of match each other at all. No, I think that the Europeans recognize that it is about China, and not just the Europeans across the world. I think people recognize this is about China. There are obviously very different ideas about how best to deal with China. The Europeans, at some level, want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have very strong economic links to China. They have their eyes on that big Chinese market. And they think that, okay, you know, we sell the Australians some submarines, that won't upset the Chinese too much, and get away with it. But they think that that's the way to do this, and they feel that by confronting China the way the United States is doing, that's the wrong way to go about it, and that more important than that, they feel that their advice is not being taken seriously, much less being heeded by the administration. Now, over in Asia, there's a very different take. I mean, if you ask the Indians and if you ask the Vietnamese and the Indonesians, that's a very different conversation. The Japanese, now the two other members of the Quad who were not part of this deal, Japan and India, welcomed the deal. I wonder if in New Delhi there are people asking themselves, wait a minute, if this is supposed to be the Anglosphere, we have more English speakers than Britain or Australia, possibly more than the United States even. But that aside, I think there's people are taking heart from the fact that the United States is in effect putting more skin in the game. Did they think that the French were going to put that much skin in the game? No. I think that the perception was that the French submarine deal in Australia was purely a commercial deal. And for all France's pronouncements of wanting to have a presence in the Pacific, the impression in New Delhi and in Tokyo was that, well, they want a presence there so that they can sell more hardware to countries that want to buy them, but they're not really committed to being part of any kind of defense against China. They believe that the Biden administration is more serious about that. They see this as a demonstration of that seriousness. And I think they welcome it.
And of course, the Japanese were competing with the French for the Supra sale to the Australians. There's always something like that in there. At least today, the 4 leaders of the Quad are actually meeting for the first time in person and for the second time ever. It's one of the big new steps that the Biden administration has taken. As part of that, is that will be seen as a further tilt. The one person who is in town who's not invited is Boris Johnson, let alone Emmanuel Macron. But so is that seen as the further tilt? Do you think that the administration is looking at the Quad as really its new main avenue for addressing the question of China and the Indo-Pacific? I mean, I love the Free in Indo-China is all about China. Maybe the acronym for Free in Indo-Pacific is China.
Well, it's code. No one's saying the word China. It's just saying free open and free Indo-Pacific. And that is a code for China. I think it's obvious that the US is strategically orienting itself towards this competition with China. And as we saw with this deal with France, scuttling this deal with France, I think the US will, is going to work with whoever they think is going to serve their interests at that time. Now, we can talk more about that, but that's the kind of transactional behavior that lost the US a lot of cred during the Trump years. And so, I don't think that the UK, I mean, I can't say, Boris Johnson really hasn't said anything about it, but given that they have this new pact, this strategic pact with the Australians and the US, I don't think they're necessarily upset that they're kind of left out of the Quad per se, but it does show that the US is more orienting itself towards the Indo-Pacific. And so whether that's dealing with Japan, India, and specifically Australia, it's rooting itself now very much in the Indo-Pacific. And so, not necessarily only France and, the UK and Germany need to think about what that means. What are US allies in the Mideast thinking right now? They're thinking that, the pivot, as Kurt Campbell kind of called it under the Obama years, which never really pivoted because you had the Arab Spring and you had all of these other crises in the world that the US could not really reorient itself. Now the pivot is really pivoting. They've made a three-quarter pivot. Maybe they're not there all the way. And, always world events can bring them back to, any one crisis, which, COVID and all of the inequalities and climate and all of the inequalities that produces is producing instability around the world. So we'll have to see if, the US will have the bandwidth to just focus on China. Right now, they're obsessed with this competition with China. And I think it's, possibly putting blinders on them to the rest of the world. And, there was charges that the US did that in the Middle East for a very long time. So I think the US, what depended on the region, continues to repeat its mistakes about just its myopic focus.
Can I offer a slightly counterintuitive view?
Yeah.
I mean, if the competition with China is a big competition. China is a big country. The Pacific is a big ocean. It's going to take more than one alliance to deal with that. There's got to have to be overlapping alliances. So there's the Quad, there is the AUKUS, there are separate deals with the Vietnamese, with the Filipinos, with the Indonesians, and there's got to be, and there are parallels, aren't they, with the Cold War, where the U.S. Went along with Europe, obviously, with on a lot of issues. But then there were other deals that the U.S. made that were not necessarily in Europe's best interest.
I don't think we're converging. It's true, and I'd love for Carla to weigh in. But what about the TPP? The U.S. didn't go in for the TPP, and now China wants to join it. So if this is their sole focus is China, they're not managing it very well.
Well, I mean, the competition is not just, a maritime competition, and it's not just in the Pacific. A lot of this competition is going to be about technology. And in that, they're going to need the Europeans. They're going to need the Europeans, and it's going to be a competition over trade, and it's going to be a competition over technology. And you can't ignore the EU, and you can't ignore, and Biden campaigned on that. He didn't say, I'm going to be a free trader. He said, I'm going to have tariffs. It's not tariffs. I'm going to have my trade competition, but I'm going to do it in concert with my allies. And when he said in concert with my allies, he meant the EU.
Yeah, and we need to move on, and there's a lot we can continue on this, but I think this last point is really, really important, and for the Europeans, and I think for other allies, this has been the wake-up call. The competition has been military and strategic, and in the economic realm, the competition hasn't changed. The allies still have sanctions, tariffs on a whole set of goods that hasn't been lifted. Only this week, the travel ban was lifted on the Europeans, and even that won't happen till November. And there is this sense, and of course in Asia, this idea that the United States is not part of the TPP or the CPTPP, and China smartly applying for membership. So did Taiwan immediately afterwards, which is just kind of interesting. There is this economic dimension that seems to be completely missing from the engagement strategy. That is important to remember. Let's move on in a slightly different way, because if there are, Elise, if the Sea of China is one really dominant concern of the administration, there are two other seas that matter greatly, and it mattered greatly this week at the UN, where the General Assembly came together, and that's, of course, climate change and COVID. And those two were front and center. The Secretary General called this, what was the phrase, a moment of extreme peril for
that the world is on the abyss.
On the abyss because of climate change, and of course we have COP26 in Glasgow in November. A lot happening on this, and Biden came for his first speech to the United Nations. Came there in his internationalist cloak, even if it was only for a few hours, to really stress those issues and America's willingness to cooperate. So Elise, talk a little bit about Biden's speech, where it fits within this larger framework of America's engagement with the world, and what the reaction sort of was at the UN for the US, even though not everybody was there in person. It was still COVID dominated. What kind of the reaction was in New York?
Well, I think it kind of really fits in like exactly what, Carla was talking about and what we're all talking about, which is that, it's all whatever Biden is saying, the competition with China is also about soft power. Okay. And so whether it's climate or whether it's COVID, the US has been facing criticism on both fronts. Biden, because of his, focus now on third shots and boosters, when the rest of the, I think, the majority of COVID vaccinations are with the top 10 wealthy countries. So, this is going to continue to be a global, truly global pandemic because the world's most vulnerable and the world's poorest countries are not getting the vaccine. So, President Biden did host a meeting on COVID. The US said it would donate an additional 500 million doses. That does bring the US to a very large, one of the largest contributors. China is also doing the same. And when Biden is talking about, climate and the need to tackle climate, and they're looking for a climate finance deal to aid some of the poorer countries in reducing their carbon imprint or footprint, they're looking for a deal with Biden. But at the same time, she said China would stop financing coal-fired power projects abroad, which is a major source of heat trapping gases. So what the UN Secretary General kind of said in his speech, and there's been a lot of criticism of Antonio Guterres over the Trump years, that he wasn't forceful enough, that he was afraid of criticizing President Trump, that Trump would just abandon the UN. I think now that Biden's back, and at his heart, he is, an internationalist, although we can talk about the tendencies that are a little bit more protectionist and isolationist. I think Gutierrez feels a little more emboldened to say, he was openly fretting about this bitter rivalry between China and the United States, essentially saying, he's encouraged by them getting, working on climate, but get your act together. This competition between the two of you is really unproductive because we have a lot of work to do in this world. There are so many crises, and he was really calling for a little bit more of solidarity in tackling these charges and not getting into this new Cold War. And so I think, but a few of what Biden's things on climate and COVID particularly were well received. But back to the idea of the democracy, human rights, it just looks a little rich right now, considering, when he's talking about the world choosing between democracy and autocracy, it looks different now that the Taliban are in control of Afghanistan with reversing those democratic gains. COVID's resurging. Look at what happened with France. I mean, the whole idea of making choices based on democratic values and allies and such, which Biden promised in his, first days of this presidency, he's still talking that talk, but I think a lot of allies don't feel that he's walking the walk. And so, we've talked about this here at World Review, like Biden is really good about framing the issue about, autocracy versus democracy and rallying the world's democracy. Whether you look at, Cuba or Haiti or South Africa or, around the world, the US and particularly in Afghanistan, the US hasn't been really good about protecting democracy and really strengthening it.
Carla, strong points by Elise on sort of the walk the walking, not really reflecting the talking that we're seeing. And I think Gutierrez really put his finger on it. On the one hand, I think we are all consumed with these transnational and big global threats that, still killing 2,000 people a day here in the United States in terms of COVID and climate change, which is also killing people in large numbers because of storms and fires and so much else. We require international cooperation. It's not going to be solved by any country working by itself. And yet the competition with China seems to make that so much more difficult. How are we going to square that circle?
Listen, in the end of the day, for Biden, he's not spending a lot of time worrying about squaring the circle. What Biden is at this point needs to do is he needs to get COVID under control in the United States, and he needs to get that legislation through Congress. I mean, he's teetering on the brink of this presidency. Is this going to be a successful presidency or a failed presidency? And he's got up until the next midterm elections, and he knows that time is running out. I mean, his big thing internationally was getting out of Afghanistan, and he blew it. He may think he did the right thing, but it looks real bad. His polls have tanked, and I think that has international implications. People will put up a lot from the United States if a president looks strong. If a president looks weak, they're not going to put up with it. So I think that, yes, he's going to have these meetings. He's going to say one thing, do something else, which is what world leaders do all of the time. It was a good speech, a reassuring speech. It was certainly a speech Donald Trump would never give. But right now, what he has to do is he needs to knock heads in Congress and get that deal through. And he needs to get those COVID numbers down, or nobody's going to take him seriously domestically or internationally.
Bobby Ghosh once said that the perception of power is power itself. To Carla's point, the perception of weakness is weakness itself too. Of course, the United States remains a very powerful country, and yet its ability to move mountains is certainly reduced. And so, how does it look from London, both the speech itself, but also the sort of the week? Did this lead to a reset, or was it just a continuation of the same criticism that we've been hearing?
Well, every conversation I've had with diplomats and politicians and people who pay attention to American foreign policy at the pointy edge of the spear, the question they ask in various forms, it boils down to this: why doesn't America believe in its own power? It's asked very often that the United States somehow seems to have lost self-belief. It's not so much that people think the US is weak. People think that the US is behaving in a way that communicates that it thinks it is weak. And that can be quite mystifying. You keep hearing these expressions from American politicians about being able to walk and chew gum at the same time, as if that is somehow some great achievement. We're supposed to be a superpower. Superpowers are supposed to be able to walk, chew gum, and hum a tune at the same time. That's the way
carrying
it's
an RPG. Yes,
exactly right, and shooting off bad guys along the way. So there is a perception, I think, that America is withdrawing its sort of into a shell out of a false sense of weakness, and there's a frustration about that. And there was some hope that Biden would, at least there was an impression from his early speeches during the campaign and then after he won the election, that there would be a corrective. That's not how he's behaving at all. He's behaving as if he thinks that the era of American power is drawing to a close, and that doesn't necessarily not everyone, I think, seeing it from afar, people don't necessarily all believe that, and if they believe that, they don't think it's a good idea for the president of the United States to communicate that.
But Bobby, I would think that this sub deal would be a corrective in part for that, beyond the stumbling way they did it.
The Australians a little bit, yeah, but
but I would think in Asia, no. It's a pretty in your face deal.
Well, it goes to show you the idea that we've been talking about, which is that they don't really care what the Europeans think. This is what they need to do. They need that kind of robust footprint in Asia. And the rest of, if Europe thinks that America is still the superpower, that they'll get over it. Like maybe it's they're acting weak, but they think that they're strong. I don't.
In some respects, maybe they are, but the for a large part of the world, the COVID challenge and the way the United States, the COVID challenge is the biggest challenge. Is the thing that everybody thinks about every morning when every world leader when they wake up in the morning. That's the first thing they're thinking about is how to deal with COVID. They're not thinking about how to deal with China or even, frankly, how to deal with climate change. They're thinking about COVID, and the United States has come very late to the game of leading. And it's still not clear that it is leading. Yes, 500 billion doses is better than 500 million doses, better than not having 500 million doses. But at the same time, you're talking about boosters and the fact that the United States is in possession of so much more of the vaccine that is not willing to share with the world. That's the perception. And that is not what people expect from the United States.
Well, and also, you know, to go back to what Carla was saying about the domestic politics, look at what we have going on in this country, which is this like plethora of disinformation, misinformation, vaccine kind of anti-vaxxers, vaccine hesitancy, which goes back to what Bobby was saying, which is like this distrust in the government. And that is reflected around the world. So when Carla and Bobby talk about, you know, perceptions, the fact that they're not perceived strong at home definitely impacts how strong they're perceived abroad. And as I'm saying, like, not only is the administration failing to consider the strategic impact of its decisions, it's also completely tone deaf to the perception of these strategic decisions. And as you know, we were saying, that is really concerning because these are supposed to be the creme de la creme of the foreign policy establishment, that when they're all appointed, there was this big sigh of relief in Washington and, you know, in foreign policy circles around the world with, you know, Blinken and his French and everything. They're like, whew, whew. And Biden was like, America's back, America's back. And, you know, everyone was like really looking for America to be back. It's not so much back yet.
Yeah, and the State Department is dropping the ball on this. I mean, the administration as a whole, but you know, how many ambassadorships are still vacant after all these months?
Well,
that's the Senate. That's
well,
Ted Cruz.
Fair enough, but you know, they should
But
be able to move. That doesn't help. Internationally, people don't care that this is about Ted Cruz. Internationally, people are looking at it and saying that this is dysfunctional American politics. Yeah. That means we don't have an ambassador from the United States.
Listen, if they get a significant infrastructure bill and a significant budget bill through that has lots of climate money in it, and they can go to Glasgow and say that, they'll be up again. If they don't, the despond is going to be even deeper.
It may be a necessary. What the question is it a sufficient condition for the return to leadership? And we will see. Rich discussion here. We have a few more minutes left, and I really, Carla, want to talk about. I hate to use the term election when it comes to what happened in Russia this week, but there was apparently something to have to do with votes and counting, even though the outcome was preordained. But I mean, massive fraud. Everybody knows it. But what struck you in this election? This is not the first time we had an election in Russia. This was parliamentary elections for the Duma. That was different this time around.
So for months, the polls were saying that Putin's party was getting about 30% of the vote. And when all was said and done, they won nearly 50% and they got a constitutional majority, which means they're going to be able to rig the system ad nauseum, the way they've been rigging the system. I mean, everyone knew the game was rigged, as you said, long before the polls was open. Navalny's in jail. His party, such as it was banned. Politicians directly aligned with him and other independents were prevented from running, a lot of them. But when Navalny shifted to this very clever strategy, this anybody but Putin, this smart voting strategy, and they identified one candidate against United Russia, no matter what their ideology was, in the 200 plus electoral districts. And they created even this smart app and websites to make it easy. Like you could put in your address and figure out who to vote for it so that you could reject United Russia. And the government, with the connivance of Google and Apple, shut the app down. There were doppelganger candidates, there were fake parties. And this is the sort of the prediction of the future, which is even worse. The government went around urging everybody in Moscow to vote online. And there was a 14-hour delay in the release of the results. The early results that were coming in had the pro-Putin candidates far behind, even in pro-Putin areas. And suddenly in Moscow, the pro-Kremlin party swept because of the online votes, and they're going to push for online voting in the future. So it's, this is the future of this. The ghost of Christmas future is a pretty scary one for this. Let me just, since we've been talking so much about Biden, talk a little bit about the reaction of the United States, which was none. If the Russians aren't objecting very loudly, we haven't seen protests in the street, which shows you something else. People are pretty resigned in Russia. Part of it's COVID, and a big part of it is, the pro-Navalny demonstrations where people were beaten up real badly. But Biden has made clear that his main priority for Russia is that it doesn't get in the way of his other priorities, like China and the pandemic and the economy. And that apparently includes not calling Moscow out for this incredibly fraudulent, I say, what shall we call it, vote? It's not an election. So on Wednesday, just a few days after these fraudulent, sorry?
Rubber stamp?
Okay, on Wednesday, just a few days after the results were released, Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was meeting his counterpart in Helsinki, trying to get the Russians to get out of the way of his bid to find some sort of basing rights in countries bordering Afghanistan. Now you could say it's a smart strategically to lessen the possibility of having a crisis with Russia when you're worried about other things. But if you're really committed to democracy, looking the other way is not a good thing.
Yeah, and if you believe that Russia represents, the largest threat to the immediate threat to the United States, which is what Biden said during the campaign, ignoring what's happening is difficult. Elise, were you as surprised about the lack of really reaction anywhere in Washington, including on the Hill and everywhere else here in the United States?
I mean, I think it goes back to the bandwidth and kind of competence issue. I don't think that there's any lack of, displeasure about it. But as Carla said, it's they're probably just have other fish to fry. And this is a kind of just a way of not poking the bear with Russia, specifically at a time when they're, fighting with France in particular. And there are so many other things that they need to deal with right now. I mean, I don't think it's a lack of disappointment or, I think it's just, I am surprised that we didn't hear from the Toria Newlands of the world or, even on Capitol Hill. I just think there's just so much that, that really directly affects the United States that people are so preoccupied with. And that goes back to what's going on in Europe. I mean, look, the Europeans have kind of, during the whole G7 summit and all this talk about Biden trying to get them to double down on China, they were saying, hey, it's Russia for us right now. Yes, we think that China is a big strategic threat, but it's Russia that is the most immediate, imminent threat to us right now. And they don't really see, yes, Biden did say Russia's the most immediate threat during the campaign. In the presidency, in the White House, he's saying something different. And it just goes to show that I know that they know in the back of their heads that Russia's, a threat, but they just can't see it through their blinders on China, in my opinion.
And also, we've heard nothing from the Republican Party, which is now confirmed as the pro-Putin party in the United States, which is frankly astonishing. If we can excuse the Biden administration because they're thinking strategically and they've got other priorities, where is the Republican Party? Nowhere. It's really quite stunning, the silence that is coming from that side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Bobby, I may have missed it, but I think there's been silence in Europe as well, even at a time that there's one of the largest military exercises taking place in the western part of Russia, right on the border with NATO, including simulated nuclear attacks on the Polish capital. Yes, in Poland, you hear that, of course, but I haven't heard a lot from the Europeans on this election, or did I miss it?
Nope, you did not miss it. Again, I point to the German election coming up this weekend. One of the most amazing things about that entire election run-up, one of the most boring election campaigns in the world, which is not a bad thing, but there was almost no discussion about foreign policy. All these people who are trying to replace Angela Merkel, we don't know what they think about foreign policy, and nowhere throughout the election process were they required to express their views about Russia, about the United States, about anything to do with how the world outside of Germany is evolving, which was really quite surprising. And symptomatic of a larger European situation. Yes, people get upset when something happens with the Americans, but when the Russians right next door are making warlike noises, crickets.
I think that's a great place to end. Even in Germany today, there's not a debate about the European Union, a pretty important part in the election. But the good news is when next week, when we come back here for another edition of World Review, we will have had the German elections and begin a discussion about what that really means. In the meantime, I want to thank Bobby Ghosh, Elise Labott, and Carla Robbins for their insight today, which was terrific. I don't think we solved a lot of problems, but we've shown a lot of light on the problems that are out there, and the problems are many. I want to thank all three of you, and for all of you watching, join us again next week for another edition of World Review. And meantime, I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ivo.
Ivo.
Thanks.